The fandango is considered one of the pillars of flamenco and today is one of the most sung palos in flamenco concerts. However, did you know that it was a time when the fandango was barely sung in the repertoire of flamenco artists? Do you want to find out what happened? In this fourth episode of the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco, we will analyze what happened and listen to some 19th century fandangos that are slightly different from fandangos in today's flamenco. Don't miss this episode.
Sounds that once were listened. Sounds that once were enjoyed. Sounds that once were danced. Sounds relegated to oblivion. And yet, there is still something we can do for them. Let us summon them. Let us summon them.
Welcome to the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco. My name is José Miguel Hernández Jaramillo and I invite you to enroll in this journey through the sounds, stories, spaces and people that were part of the 19th century flamenco. Hi there, how are you? I hope you are very well. We begin this fourth episode of the podcast Forgotten Sounds of Flamenco dedicated to the fandango. But first, I'd like to remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast in the leading platforms such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iVoox or Amazon Music. You can also watch this episode on the YouTube channel Sonidos Olvidados del Flamenco Creativa. I'd like to thank all of you because the Spanish version of this podcast, Sonidos Olvidados del Flamenco, got last January 13 the first place in the ranking of podcasts in Spain in the category Music History. Thanks very much. In this episode, I'm going to talk about the results of a research that I did a few years ago. It was presented at a conference at the Central University of New York entitled The Fandango in the 19th Century Flamenco, The Untold Story. The paper is written in English, so in the description of the YouTube video of this episode, I leave you the link in case you want to download and read it. You have probably heard a general theory that the fandango is one of the pillars of flamenco. However, it was not always like that. It was quite the opposite in a certain period. Today, fandango is one of the most sung palos in festivals and flamenco peñas or flamenco clubs. In the last decades of the 19th century, when flamenco became very popular through Spain, the fandango was not one of the most popular songs. In fact, it was hardly performed in the repertoire of flamenco artists. Although it may seem surprising, the most popular palos were the petenera and the malagueña, and in the last decade of the century also the tango. At that time, the fandango was considered to be an old and somewhat outdated music, an old-fashioned dance. This also happened with other dances that were very popular at the beginning of the 19th century, such as the cachucha, the zorongo, or the bolero. Zarzuelas are a good indicator of what is in fashion at a given moment and what the public demands. And we have evidences that reflect this. For example, have you noticed that the fandango hardly appears in zarzuelas? Quite the opposite of what happened with peteneras, zapateados, guajiras, panaderos, or tangos, among others, where there are plenty of them. Between 1840 and 1915, I only knew a few zarzuelas that contain fandangos. For example, there are fandangos in Chorizos y Polacos by Francisco Barbieri in 1876, El Baile de Luis Alonso by Jerónimo Jiménez in 1897, and the zarzuela Soledad by Joaquín Gené in 1906. This low number contrasts with other flamenco palos such as the malagueña present in at least 78 zarzuelas or the petenera in 43, according to the analysis that Lénica Reyes carried out in her PhD dissertation. For example, when Jerónimo Jiménez begins the intermezzo of La Boda de Luis Alonso's wedding, with a fandango, he does so because this zarzuela tells a story in the Cádiz of the first half of the 19th century. This piece is a medley that contains dances that were fashionable at the time of the dancer Luis Alonso. Let's listen to this fandango played by many pianos in my computer. Maybe it sounds familiar to you. Indeed, the fandango was very popular in the 18th century and first half of the 19th century. Still, from the second half of this century, we hardly find fandangos played in theaters or events of the aristocracy, contrary to what happened with other flamenco palos such as malagueñas, peteneras, tangos, zapateados, oleadas, or sevillanas. Another indicator of the scarce popularity of the fandango at this period is how some author describes or name it. For example, Francisco Barbieri describes it as primitive in 1861, Rueda Santos as classic in 1887, and Francisco Vidal-Careta as antique in 1914. For example, this last author, Francisco Vidal-Careta, was a doctor and wrote a book on music therapy in 1914. And in this book, he comments on the absence of the fandango from the flamenco repertoire. He literally says, "In the town where I live, what you rarely hear sung is the old fandango, father of all the typical tunes of the Andalusian region. You will listen to everywhere malagueñas, rondeñas, murcianas, farrucas, marianas, let's say cantejondo, but rarely you will be able to savor in all its purity the truly popular song, the artistic, sentimental, expressive fandango, without gorgoritos." The reasons for this decline of the fandango are still unclear and should be further researched. Still, I could suggest a hypothesis. At that time, the fandango was mainly a dance, contrary to what happened with malagueña, which, although there are references that it was dance, it was a style that was usually sung, and if possible, in the most virtuosic way. Given its almost exclusively danceable character, the fandango suffered the decadence of the dance that occurred around the decade of the 70s of the 19th century, after the splendor of the dances in Spain in the middle of the century. This piece we are listening to is a fandango written in the 1870s by the composer Isidoro Hernández. If you remember, one of the jarabes we heard in the second episode of this podcast was also a composition by him. About this composer Isidoro Hernández and his flamenco work, I think we need to dedicate not one but many episodes. Let's listen to some of this piece to give you an idea of the sonority that the fandango had a century and a half ago. As you probably noticed, it is slightly different from the fandango we know today in flamenco. Another indicator of the scarce presence of the fandango in the flamenco of that time is provided by the statistics. I often use statistical analysis in my research because big data allows us to see realities that at first glance would be unnoticed. In this case, I analyzed the presence of the fandango in the first recording of flamenco songs from the last years of the 19th century. To do so, I performed a quantitative analysis of the fandangos recorded in relation to other flamenco palos. I searched the online database of recordings of the Centro Andaluz de Documentación del Flamenco, which collects data from more than 4,000 flamenco recordings of all times since 1897. Well, the total flamenco recordings between 1897 and 1915 in this archive are 715. And do you know how many fandangos I found? Only 11, which is 1.52% of the total flamenco recordings in this period. And do you know how many malagueñas were recorded in that period? About 100. The malagueña was the most recorded song. Almost 14th of the flamenco recordings in that period were malagueñas. The fandango ranks 16th among the palos regarding the number of recordings. If you are watching this episode on the YouTube channel Sonidos Olvidados Etnomusicología Creativa, you can see the complete statistical graph. All of these indicators and some others that I don't have time to mention in this episode shows us a story so far untold by flamencology or musicology. The fandango was about to disappear from the list of flamenco palos. The fandango lost the danceable character that defines in the 18th and 19th century. Nowadays, it is a palo that is hardly danced, but fortunately enjoys excellent health within flamenco. Finally, I invite you to reflect on the directions that flamenco musical research has taken, on the stories that has been told, and on those that has been silenced and are still forgotten. If you like this episode, I will be grateful if you subscribe to the podcast and share it on your social media. Thanks for supporting the project. Enjoy and see you in 2 weeks.